Welcome to Mr. Smith's Indoor Garden Videogram. You know, there's such a wide range of plants to choose from for the indoor gardener, and so many aspects in the house. The house offers as many aspects as the garden outside. But there are plants that test the skill of the expert. And yet there are plants like the ivy that encourage the raw beginner because they'll grow virtually anywhere. But half the fun of indoor gardening is finding out where the plant will grow best. And once you've got it right, there's no doubt about it that plants brighten up the home. And they give you a fascinating hobby as well. Coleus must be one of the most popular of all foliage plants, and I think deservedly so. But to keep the brightly coloured leaves in healthy condition, they need good but diffused light. Too much sun, too much shade can cause the leaves to fade. And they need a temperature of around 60 degrees Fahrenheit and quite a lot of water in the summertime. Now, you can grow them from seed, but when you've got a particularly attractive leaf colour, then the best way to make certain you're going to reproduce that is to take cuttings. Cut your parent plant back like that. What you're trying to do is make it produce young, strong, non-flowering growth, short-jointed, like this one here, not a great distance between the leaf joints, and not too sappy. Just the sort of young shoot that will root quickly without wilting. And I'm going to take it off low down, close to the stem, and then trim the lower leaves off. You don't want anything that's going to rot underneath the rooting compost. And then mix up your compost for rooting. And the material I use always for Coleus is a mixture of sand and a loamy soil. I don't find they do quite so well in the peat-based compost. Loam seems to make them work harder because you've got to make Coleus work hard all the time. If you get them too soft, too sappy, then you lose the intensification of leaf colour, which is the whole beauty of the plant. And even though Coleus do root very easily, I dip them in rooting powder. Take every opportunity of making certain that the conditions you provide are perfect for rooting. Right down, push it right down to the bottom of the hole so that lower leaf joint there is just buried, really on the surface rather than buried, because I'm coppering both my bets there. And a tap to settle everything into intimate contact. If there's any airspace around the base of the cutting, then it's not going to root. And then put it in a place where it'll be warm, where it'll be moist, because you don't want the leaves losing moisture until the roots form. If you're in doubt about the air being dry, then put a polythene bag over the top, but make certain that the leaves aren't touching the side of it, because that beauty of foliage is easily destroyed, and they'll start to rot off. And then in 3 or 4 weeks' time, the plant should be well enough rooted to have a quick look. And actually, it's obvious that this one has, because the leaves are upright, they're thick, they're healthy. And at this stage, I like to stop it, to take the growing tip out. If you've got long fingernails, that's fine. Only that much. Don't go and butcher it, because what you're doing, you're trying to make the young growths break from each of the leaf joints. It can't grow from anywhere else on the stem except a leaf joint. And what you want is a stocky, well-foliaged plant with a mass of these brightly coloured leaves. If you don't nip the top out, it goes on growing like a palm tree, and you get a single stem and nothing else. But just to make certain. There, you see, the roots are beginning to explore the compost, but they're not far enough into it. I like to make Coleus work all the time. Put them in a rich compost. You get soft, fleshy growth. You don't get the brightly coloured leaves. So I want that root ball to be very, very much more pot-bound than it is then. And even then I won't feed it. I'll keep it working for a living. You've got to be cruel to be kind. Then if your chemistry's right, this is what you end up with. Now, with any other plant but a Coleus, I would say that was getting pot-bound. But with a Coleus, I don't want it in a rich compost. I don't want it in a big pot. So I'm going to give it another week or two to fill the rest of the space there with roots. And then I'll move it into a pot only one size bigger. No more. I don't want to spoil it. And that is what they should look like. Short, stocky plant, well furnished with leaves and with foliage that looks like gold-edged red velvet, that adds dignity to any room. Ferns are one of the most compellingly interesting plants that I've ever grown. But one thing that they do all the time, and that is express a coolness and an elegance that no other plant can match. They are a true foliage plant. You don't get any flowers, but they have such a quality of foliage interest that you don't mind that there's no flowers there. Just look at that. You've got a contrasting stem, a blue-black stem, and the very pale green of the frond coming from it, the maidenhair fern. But the one thing that they do demand is cool, shady, humid conditions. They don't like hot air, they don't like a dry air. And the one thing that I discovered to my regret was the fact that you can't clean the foliage with one of the chemical leaf cleaners. Don't ever touch them with a chemical. All they want is a spray over with water when it's warm weather. And give them a position in a north-facing room, if possible, where the light is good but very diffused, and where you can keep the temperature fairly low, around about 55 is ideal. And once you've got one plant, it's very easy to turn it into two or three, because they all have the happy knack of being easily divided. Take the ladder fern. They're an entirely different texture of foliage. Look at those two together. You don't need anything else. You don't need flowers because you've got the foliage contrast, the different colors. Knock them out of the pot. And that's the sort of root system they form. A great mass of brown tentacles growing round, but always with some of the fatter storage roots there in the compost. And when I'm splitting these up, I take some of the fatter roots with each of the young plantlets. Do it when growth is starting. Tip it up that way, away from you. Find out where the plant has divided naturally. If you can see there, there's obviously the makings of two different plants there. You get your fingers in, they're very tough, which is a bonus. Anything that's tough is going to be able to put up with being riven apart like that. There, it's falling into natural divisions without a great deal of discomfort to the plant. And they don't need a special compost. What I do is use a John Innes, and I mix in an extra part of sand and an extra part of peat. And it's about the size of pot. Don't stint them. See, there's a young plant that expresses all the elegance, all the arching pattern. It is a pretty thing, the ladder fern, really it is. Lovely. Little tap in there like that. If I used any smaller pot, I would be constricting those roots too much, and it'd be a waste of time repotting. Firm it down. And firm it fairly hard, because I'm going to stand them in a tray for at least 10 days after I've repotted. That's a tray, rather, a saucer with water in it. And then, because I'm going to take it into the house, this one's going into the room, I'm just going to clip those off. There. That really is elegant. And I noticed when I was pulling it apart that the fronds themselves were sporing. There you can see the little, what you would almost call the seed of the fern. It's an embryo seed, put it that way. But they're not quite ripe. They're not quite ready for taking. But I've got some dried off. I took them off and hung them up in a paper bag. And take those out. And there's a great massive spores in the bottom of the bag there. And those I'm going to sow on top of a mixture of peat and sand, something that is free-draining and yet will hold the moisture. And because they're very fine and dust-like, just get the paper, start at one side of the pot, and very gently tap it. And by doing it like that over the top of the compost, you make certain that the spores are evenly spread. You don't get them all down in one place. And then what I want there is close, humid, warm, moist conditions, exactly what the young ferns need to get away properly. So what we did without polythene, I'll never know, because it's the perfect cover for a pot like that. I've encased it. Now I've given it a little world all of its own. And I didn't water it on purpose because I work on the principle that you put it where it can get as much as it wants and no more. And if I'd watered that from above, I'd have washed every one of those little spores around the edge of the pot. And they'd been awfully crowded in there. So get a saucer of water, fairly deep saucer, and pop it in like that. And that will take up moisture. I'll keep filling that up until there's a film of moisture right over the top of the compost. I didn't do it by plunging because, again, you get a rush of water coming up, you get a film of moisture on the surface, and these spores are so very, very light that they float, they bob about all over the top and all sucked to the edge. That way, it'll take what it wants, no more. And keep watching, because in about 3 weeks, in close, humid conditions like that, you'll get a film of green over the top of the compost. Don't do anything then. Leave it there until you see the little fronds coming up. And then you can dig them out and you can pot them up in very small pots. Use very tiny pots, what we call thumb pots, about that big. And use the same compost that you potted the parent up into, with a lot of peat and a lot of sand. And they are elegant. They are the most attractive plants. Think of a fireplace in summer, dead, no fire there, just a gaping hole. And take a fern and stand it in front of it and see the way the fronds take off the bareness, the darkness of the stone, and bring the room to light. They are very, very beautiful pot plants. Poinsettias express better than any other plant the real pleasure of indoor gardening. To get brilliant coloured bracts like that in the middle of winter, well, what more could a gardener ask? And you can get them not only in vivid scarlet, you can get them in pink, you can get them in creamy yellow as well, so you can have a whole patina of colour using poinsettias alone. And it's no use buying a plant of that quality and taking it straight out into the freezing cold winter weather. That's the surest way to kill it. Make sure before you take it out it's properly wrapped, that you get it home as quick as you can, and then give it a position in good light, but not direct sunlight. And I find a temperature when you've got it into the house of around 60, 65 is ideal. They don't want very high temperatures. And be careful with the watering. Don't overwater, don't underwater. Wait until the compost is just dry on top, and then soak them from underneath so they're thoroughly wet. And feeding, well, there's really enough feed in the compost to keep the plant going. So don't overfeed it, leave it alone. And they really are a joy to the eye. And after 3 or 4 months in the house, most poinsettias, mine included, look something like this. They're a wee bit tired of it. They're getting old, they're getting past it. And dry them off, thoroughly dry them off. What I'm trying to do is make this plant rest. I've had the beauty of it for a long, long time. I want to rest it. And the only way you can make them rest is to dry them off. That soil is as dry and arid as the Sahara Desert. And when it's comfortably dried off, and when the leaves are beginning to yellow and turn brown, and it's obvious that all growth has stopped, cut it back. Don't throw it away. You've had the beauty of it, and by taking care of it now, you can probably repeat that beauty next year. What I'm going to do is to cut it back, to force the young shoots into growth by watering the soil, by, if necessary, feeding it. Don't be frightened to do the job properly, because I want some shoots, but I don't want too many shoots. In other words, I'm cutting to leave 1, 2, possibly 3 buds to break there. Same with that one. A rough average, about what, 4 or 5 inches. And there, this is the important thing with poinsettias. The milky latex there, oozing out of the cuts at the top. You've got to seal those off, like that, with charcoal, or with a little bit of cigarette ash if you're a smoker. Anything that'll mildly cauterize the wounds you've left and stop it oozing and continuing to ooze this latex. Now, at that stage, all I've got to do now is to start and water it, and if necessary, feed it. The whole aim of this process is to boost growth, to get young shoots that make perfect cuttings. And as simple as that. The plant's eager to grow. You've given it a holiday, and it wants to go. And when they get to this stage, they're ideal for making cuttings. Those young growths that you've forced up with the watering and the feeding are just at the right stage. Vitally important that you cut below node with euphorbias. Because even though you cut below node, that's what happens. You get bleeding from the wound, and you must seal that off very quickly. See, it's dripping from the base of the cutting there, and the same thing applies with that. A little bit of sealant, charcoal, and a touch of rooting powder to stimulate rooting. What you want to do is get roots on them as quick as possible so the roots can replace the moisture the leaves are losing. And I mix my own compost for rooting into. It's a mixture of 1 part peat, 1 part sand, and get them into that as quick as possible. Hold with your finger. Push the cutting right down to the base of the hole. You don't want any airspace at the bottom at all. Right on the edge of the pot, clay pot. And then there's room for 1, 2 more cuttings there. Take the next one. Take your time, look for the right place to cut. Don't go in like a butcher and cut the first shoot that you come to. Underneath the node, clean, sharp cut. Seal it very, very quickly, because the great upsurge of sap that is produced by spring growth never fails to astound me. The energy that must go into that. And then seal your cutting. There's 2 leaves there that'll have to come off as well, and that means 2 more cuts. Nip them like that. You've actually stimulated the plant by wounding it even more. So put the rooting powder on the wound at the base and on the 2 wounds at the side into the compost. Tap to settle it down. Important always with cuttings that you push it right to the bottom of the hole, that you firm it in so that the rooting medium, the sand and peat, are in close and intimate contact with the base of the cutting. There's no airspace there to stop them rooting. Water it very, very quickly. And if you've got a propagating frame, put it into it, because there it's ideal, warm and humid. If you haven't, my mother has a trick. She makes a loop of wire, 2 of them, U-shaped, to make a framework over the top of the pot and then cover it with polythene, and the wire loops hold the polythene away from the plant leaves, and you've got just the warm, humid conditions that encourage rooting. The quicker, the better, in 4 to 6 weeks with a bit of luck. But I'm not going to throw the old plant away, because if you look there, you can see the buds beginning to break up the stem. And by watering, and by feeding, and by cherishing that plant, you've got to take care of it. In due course, I'll have something that looks like that. And the euphorbia is interesting. It shares something in common with things like chrysanthemums. Those bracts, the coloured leaves that give the plant their interest, don't start to colour until you get the short days, until you get under 12 hours of daylight, and keep them warm, a temperature of about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, well watered, and then you'll get that flaming vermilion bract that's such a joy to look at Christmas time. You know, a rubber plant really is like a highly polished piece of furniture. If you don't dust it regularly, you lose a lot of its beauty. And it is the most popular of the foliage plants. It's the sort of plant that everyone gives as a present because it's easy to look after. This is a great thing with a plant that will go on growing for years and years, provided you look after it right. And what do you look for when you're buying it in a garden centre or a nursery? Well, you want a short jointed plant. You don't want something that's been pulled right out of recognition. You want the shortest possible distance between the nodes. You don't want a plant where the bottom leaves are going yellow. This is a common failing with a lot of rubber plants. It means they haven't been treated properly. And you want something that's big enough to see when you put it on the dining room table or in a corner of the room. And having bought it and paid your money for it, make sure it's wrapped before you take it home, because particularly in winter, if you're walking through the streets and it's freezing cold and you take a plant out of a greenhouse, it can be damaged so severely by the time you get it home that it's not worth having anyway. And having got it home, where do you put it? Well, of course, the place that you'd like to see it in best, but do make certain that it's not in full sun. They've got big evergreen leaves. This is typical of a plant that grows in jungle conditions. Fairly shady, very, very humid. They've got an enormous leaf expanse to lose moisture from. Water it regularly, particularly in summer. Make sure that the compost is kept evenly moist, but in winter, remember it isn't growing. So don't water it quite as much. I tend to let the compost get as dry as that. It's almost bone dry on top, but moist underneath. And that's a good indication to make certain that you're not getting it over wet in winter. In summer, well, it is very difficult to overwater in summer. The thing is, you can see the extension growth that's going on there. That's the growth that's taking place now. It needs a lot of moisture to push that along. But this is a fine, healthy plant. There's no sign of yellow leaves at the base, but obvious signs that it needs repotting. The roots are right through onto the top there. Easy enough to repot. Don't use a pot very much bigger than the one it's in. Try it first. Just about a fit. I can just get my fingers down between the edge of the pot that I'm putting it into and the one that it's in already. So that'll do fine. And whenever I'm riddling peat, I keep a little bit of the tailings, a little bit of the coarse stuff that won't go through the riddle to use for bottoming off pots. Because especially when you're working indoors, you don't want the compost that you're going to use going straight through the drainage holes. And a little bit of coarse peat holds the moisture and stops the compost going through, like that. And use a peat-based compost. Increasingly, I'm finding that a lot of the loam-based compost, the standard varies so much that I'm never sure what it's going to do to my plant. The peat-based seem to be fairly standard, particularly for things like a rubber plant. Fingers over the top of the pot like that. Don't ever knock it out holding, because the thing will shoot out and bounce on its top, which doesn't do any plant any good. There you've got it secure. Stem between the fingers, smart tap on the bottom, and you can see how the roots have been forced up. They've gone down as far as they can. They're matted on the bottom. They've been forced up out of the top of the pot, which was the only place there was any room. Check for level. That is just about right. You want enough space at the top for watering, and yet it wants to be firmly anchored, so it's just about the right level. Firm it down, not too much like that. You'll know very quickly whether you haven't got all the interstices between the side of the pot and the root ball of the plant filled the first time you water it, because all the holes that weren't filled before will be sucked down with the water and filled with compost, and you'll have a gap at the top. But that's easy enough to top off. The best way of settling any plant down, good tap like that. Now, I couldn't straighten that plant up because it was growing a wee bit off-centre. The way I'll straighten it up is to put that side to the dark part of the room, this side towards the light, and the plant will naturally grow towards the light and straighten up. All I've got to do now is water it and put it in a focal point in the room. Always with a strong personality plant, with a positive foliage plant like this, give them a focal point in the room, make them a centre of attention. They'll do the rest for you. It's no use having a feature plant if the foliage, which is the plant's main attraction, gets dirty and clogged up with soot and dust. And all you need to do is take a sponge and some tepid water and just very carefully clean the leaves off. There, look how the light catches that. When it's clean, it seems to pick up and change the tones of green. And in addition, of course, the leaf is a living, functioning factory. The sunlight falling on there is the source of the food supply for the whole plant. If that leaf is discoloured with dirt, there's less light gets into it, and of course the whole factory tends to break down. And also the surface and the underneath part of the leaf is covered with a whole series of fine holes, and the plant breathes through those. And if they get clogged up with dirt, then it can't breathe properly, and the leaves turn yellow, they get discoloured, and you don't want anything that mars the overall beauty of a feature plant. This is part of the art of gardening. You've got to work with it, you've got to look after it, you've got to tend its needs, and then you get the satisfaction of a really healthy looking plant. You can use manufactured cleaning fluids, but if you're using a fluid for the first time, then be very careful. Far better to try it on one of the lower leaves that's out of sight, one of the little ones, and then wait a week. And if there's no sign of discoloration, you can do the whole plant. And if you've got a plant with soft foliage, like a fern, or a plant with hairy leaves, then don't use any cleaner on it at all. The only thing you can really do with that is to dust it with a very light duster. This particular plant, as the leaves mature, you begin to get the indentations in the leaf that give the plant its popular name, the Swiss cheese plant. I'd rather like it when you get 3 or 4 different shapes of leaves, some deeply cut like that one, some only just beginning with only a couple of incisions, and some altogether plain. It adds to the overall interest of the plant. It gives you a different light reflection as well. And they do form what we call aerial roots, which grow out up the stem. And the thing to do with these is to tuck them back into the compost, so they're forming a function. Actually tuck them into the compost that the plant's growing in. Or, when they get longer, double pot it. That's to put the pot that the plant's growing in inside another container, making sure it hasn't got a hole in the bottom. And then in the base of it, you put either moist peat or wet sphagnum, and then you tuck the roots back into there, and they're helping the plant. They're absorbing the moisture. They're helping to cut down the moisture loss from the leaves. It's naturally trailing in habit, so you have to stake it. The best thing to do is to get a support that's strong enough to hold the plant up, that's unobtrusive and made even more unobtrusive by wrapping it round with moist sphagnum moss or osmunda fibre, anything that'll hold moisture, and then you've created a reservoir there. It will take it up from the soil if you keep it moist. If you pour a little water down it, it keeps it moist, and then as that water evaporates, it puts a layer of moist air round the leaves, and that cuts down the moisture loss from the leaves almost immediately. The more humidity you can keep in the atmosphere, the better for the plant. Most important point of all, don't ever grow a big leaf plant like this in full sun. Nothing takes the gloss off the leaf quicker. It goes a silvery grey, and very, very quickly the leaves begin to go brown round the edges and droop and die. And when that happens, there's nothing really you can do about it except take it into the hospital, pop it in the bathroom. But by regular watering, by keeping it in a shady place, by tucking your roots back into the compost so they're performing a function, by staking it and keeping the stake and its moss covering moist, and by sponging the leaves, then it becomes an object of beauty, a real feature plant. Palms are amongst my favourite house plants. They have a grace and an elegance that few plants can equal, and they enjoy cool, shady conditions, which means you can use them in a north-facing room. And one that I'm particularly fond of is the Camedora elegans, and you can grow this particular palm from seed. There's only one problem. You've got to give it very, very, very hot conditions to germinate. Temperatures of around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And the only place you can have that, of course, if you haven't got a greenhouse, is in the airing cupboard. Put a handful of peat in a clear polythene bag and get the seeds. Those are big seeds, quite big seeds. There's an awful lot of food in there, but the seed coat is very, very hard. But pop them inside a polythene bag like that with the peat. Shake them up so they're well mixed. Wrap the top over. And I hang that in the airing cupboard so it's just above the cistern. The warmest place in the house. The temperature is tropical, not touching the cistern, otherwise it gets too hot. It gets all the warm air, the even temperature. Inside the bag, it's like a little tropical greenhouse. You've got the moisture, the humidity, and the warmth. But you must check them every day. Remember, they're in a dark airing cupboard. Immediately the seed begins to break, to chit. That is, the capsule begins to split. They've got to come out into the light. If you don't check them for a fortnight and they've germinated, you're going to have something that looks like a white rush in the airing cupboard, and they never make good plants after that. But if you've got a greenhouse, you can sow them in the normal way, using a peat-based compost. And with a big seed like this, you can space them out on top of the mixture, not too many to a pot. You shouldn't need to water that compost anymore. Don't get the compost soggy wet. That doesn't encourage germination. It really encourages rotting. It wants to be evenly moist. Now, a sheet of glass over that and a newspaper and into the greenhouse where it's warm and temperate. Don't be impatient. If it's not up within 2 months, wait, because the compost is doing your work, the conditions are right, the seed will come up, and after a year, and I really mean a year, this is how long this took, they look something like this. Already the character of the plant is established, this quality of grace that, to my mind, is almost unequalled in houseplants, the leaf beginning to arch over to display the frond. It really is a treasure of a palm tree. But they want moving on then. And strangely enough, the Camedora is one plant that doesn't really mind being overpotted. With a lot of plants, if you put them into a big pot, then you get root stagnation and the thing damps off. But with the Camedora, it's a most obliging little thing. That. Oh, boy. Don't want 2 in a pot, though. And take the moss off. That's indicative of the conditions you've given it, the moisture and the humidity. And there, incredible. That shows how hard the seed is. There's the little seed that the plant grew from, the husk of the seed. So you can imagine how much warmth and humidity and moistening that's taken to break to let the little shoot grow out. I'll leave it on, not doing any harm. Good root system. All the qualities I look for in a young plant. Very gently. Down into the compost. That is something that is going to be in your house if you care for it properly. Remember, coolness, temperature about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Good light. Don't forget to water it. Not too much. Just needs enough water to keep the compost moist. And there, even at that stage, that plant is elegant. And it'll go on becoming more and more elegant until it gets to this stage. This is Big Brother. The foliage is carried fairly closely to the stem at this stage, but the same graceful arch, the same quality that the plant carries right through its life until it gets to the near maturity. It really is an elegant, graceful plant. When you're walking round a garden centre, you know, there's no way that you can overlook the Crotons, the Joseph's coat. They've got such spectacular leaf colours that they make an immediate impact on you. But what do you look for if you're buying a Croton for the first time? You want a plant that's furnished right down to the base like that. No sign of bare stem. It's beautifully formed. It's been well grown under ideal conditions. And once you get it into the home, try it in various places until you find a position it likes. And that sort of position is in an even temperature. It wants nothing less, really, if you can provide it, than 65 degrees Fahrenheit, nice and even. And once you've discovered the position that it likes, leave it there. It hates being moved around. And it wants humidity, too. If you get a dry atmosphere, it tends to drop. But eventually, no matter how well you grow them, you're going to get the lower leaves beginning to fall, to leave a bare stem. This is a natural habit. It's not your bad gardening. It's a natural habit of the plant because it grows under conditions of intense competition. So it's thrusting up all the time. And to prevent that, if you look there, there's a growing point deep down in the tip of the plant there. Now, frequently, that will die of its own volition, and then the shoots will come from the base. But if you've got a plant that's persisting in growing up and up and up, all you've got to do is get a pair of tweezers and very gently nip it out. That's all it needs. That little terminal portion of the stem, a fractional little piece, enough to stop it growing, enough to make it branch out. But in the course of time, it does get to this stage. It begins to look like a standard rather than a houseplant. But I'm beginning to think in terms of taking cuttings. And by heading them back, by making it branch, I've produced the ideal cuttings, the ideal material for cutting taking. There's a shoot there, just beginning to harden at the base, still young and soft at the top. It's young enough to root very, very quickly, yet mature enough to survive long enough for the roots to be produced. This is the critical period. Taking cuttings, you've got to make sure that they're there, ready to be taken, ready to root, not too early, not too late. And that's just about right. That is a good cutting. Just beginning to firm at the base, and yet still soft at the top. Young enough to root quickly, which is the aim, because when anything is evergreen, immediately you take it from the plant, it doesn't stop losing moisture. It goes on pumping it out, and very quickly the leaves begin to droop and they die. And once that happens with a Croton, your chances are very slim indeed. Take the lower leaves off. You can nip them off with your fingers, and I work on the principle that you're going to put almost half that stem into the compost. And wounding is good for cuttings within limits, the more you wound like that, the more you stimulate the plant by cutting it, the more root system you're going to get and the quicker you're going to get it. And the mixture I use is my old standby, the 2 parts of sand, 1 of peat. Abrasive and yet moisture holding. And dip that in rooting powder and then take the finger and rub the rooting powder over the wounds, up the stem. Every little scrap of root I get gives that plant a better chance of surviving. And the quicker it's off the plant and into the compost, the better. Make a hole in the compost with your fingers. Bury about half the cutting. Firm it well in, tap. And then water it, not over the leaves. Soak the compost, make sure the compost's wet, and that evaporates around the leaves. I don't like to get the leaves wet before the roots are there, but because those leaves are evergreen, and because they haven't stopped losing moisture because I've taken it from the plant, cut down transpiration loss by putting a rubber band loosely. Don't put it tight or you kink the veins of the leaf, and that bruises them and they discolour right round where you've nipped them. That's just about it. You've cut down the area of leaf where it loses moisture. You've married it in and put it into the frame or into anywhere where it's going to have a warm bottom, a cold top. This is vital with crotons, a warm bottom, cool top. And one thing I found, the plastic bag trick with croton cuttings doesn't work. If you put them inside a tightly closed plastic bag, they get soft rot and they damp off, and that's it. They need, after about a week, that little current of air to keep the air circulating, cut down the risk of fungus disease. Gradually lift it until after a period of about 3 weeks, you can take the top off. It's there, rooted, ready to go indoors, to be potted on. And when you get that sort of development of root out of the base of the pot, no need to knock it out to see whether it's rooted. It's rooted right enough. It's itching to be out into something bigger. It's grown up. It wants more than baby food. It wants something with a bit of meat into it. And I pot the cuttings up into a loam-based compost. There are some plants that like a richer diet than a peat-based compost can provide. Loam gives them that. It's the liver and kidney of the gardening world, something with a bit of body into it. They've started to go round and round the bottom of the pot and then out through the drainage hole. Let them get past that stage so the base of the root is matted. And they're very reluctant to root out into the new compost. It's very difficult to get them to start again, as they say. So use a loam mixture. Good earth. Peat and sand. It has a smell that's entirely different to the peat-based mix. And not too big a pot. You don't want to overpot, you don't want to underpot. It's a question with the Joseph's coat of getting everything just right. If you're in doubt how much compost to put into the bottom of the pot, try it. That's just about right. Your compost wants to be just below the level it was in the smaller pot. Fill around the sides. This mixture is a wee bit dry, but I'm not worried about that because I'm going to soak it from the base anyway to make sure the whole of the mixture is evenly moist. And firm it with your fingers down the side. Tap the pot to level it off. There. All I've got to do is drop that into a soak tank, let it get thoroughly moist, and it can go in with the rest of the houseplant collection. And already, the character of the plant is there. The brighter coloured leaves at the base, the top, a paler green, which will eventually colour. But the contrast is attractive, and it's not just the individual leaf colours that complete the plant. It's all the variations in leaf shape that you can get in the Joseph's coat that make it such a fascinating plant to collect. There are so many attractive stove plants, that is, plants that need fairly moist, humid, high temperatures, that in most houses the only way you can be certain of getting them comfortable is to grow them in a terrarium. Now, that can be anything from an old obsolete aquarium to a thing specially made for the job. And there you give them exactly the conditions they'd get at home, in the jungle. Moisture, humidity, a controlled temperature. But the main virtue of this form of gardening, as far as I'm concerned, is I can garden. I can get in and I can build little hillocks, and I can arrange plants so that each one complements or contrasts with the other. So I get the benefit of a whole border of foliage, if you like, in miniature. And I've already put a layer of gravel on the bottom to provide drainage, mixed up with a good handful or two of charcoal to keep it all sweet and nice. And then on top of that, I've used a peat-based compost, but to every 3 parts of the compost, I've put a part of gravel to give it the sharp, gritty drainage. And I don't want fast growth. I don't want things burgeoning out of the top. That's not the idea. I want to put little plants in, and I want to watch them grow slowly into the picture that I had in my mind when I created it. Put the tall ones in first. One of my favourites, the rattlesnake plant. Now, it's not the easiest to grow. I wouldn't argue about that. But you get it right in these conditions, and it's beautiful. You've got the height. It lifts the whole landscape up. And I split a bigger plant up to get this one and kept it in water while I was doing it. Don't ever treat your plants as if they weren't alive. They're growing. Twist it round. Dig the hole. Pop the roots in. Feather it down a little bit. Manipulate it round. The long arching stems. Lift the whole landscape up like that. Beautiful. They'll curve over. It's just stood up because I was messing around with it. They'll curve over and fit. The quality of the foliage. This is the tree in the miniature garden landscape. This is the copper beech at the end of the garden in miniature. Gets even more exciting. Think of a garden in undulations. You're creating undulations with your foliage patterns. The ivy. Beautiful things, ivies. This is one of the hardy ones, but it's a miniature. It won't go romping all over the miniature garden and out of the top and into the sitting room. It'll take a long time to do that. And it's fairly root-bound, so it'll be even happier to get out of there. Because what I'm going to do with this is put it in there. See how that lifts up the side of the container? I've got an ivy exactly like this, growing out in the garden, creating exactly the same impression, giving me height up a wall at the back of a border. And as you always use the walls in a garden, it's another dimension. So you use the walls of a terrarium. See how that's lifting up now? And the beautiful foliage pattern, the contrast between the dark red of the rattlesnake underleaf and the green and white of the ivy. This is what gardening's all about. Not plants as individuals, stick them in and it doesn't matter, but plants as a collection, as an association. I'm not sure whether I like the zebra plant better as a foliage plant or when it's in flower. But certainly in the terrarium garden, I'm going to take the flowers off because I want the foliage. It's a contrast. Aren't they pretty, though, really? You get the combination. I'm particularly emphasising the variegated, the lighter colours at this end of the terrarium, making a point of grouping the variegations. They're so totally different in leaf colour. That's pretty as a picture. And there's not a flowering plant in yet. Now, I know you can get St. Paulias in dark purple, in dark red, but in this setting, you want a light colour. It's going to be in a room, and you want something that lifts it a little bit. But it's even smiling through the glass, that one, because they love these sort of conditions. They really do enjoy the warmth and moist atmosphere. And the great advantage of this sort of garden is that you can get your hands in and take the dead flowers off. There. Now, something a little bit brighter. Be a little gorblimey in the middle. Nurtura depressa, the bead plant. Like a little hummock covered with grandmother's orange beads. Don't be frightened of contrasting colours. If it screams too hard, you can always let it out again. And I must confess to picking a lot of my favourite plants for this. The little earth star, there's nothing self-important or assuming about it. It's beautifully foliaged. And then when it's going to flower, you get a little tuft in the centre there, as if it was almost apologising for having the temerity to flower. I like it. I think it's great. And this will keep the line flat. Do you know, there's the same satisfaction working in a terrarium garden like this, with your fingers in the soil, as you get from planting up a border outside. And I can now go up, very determinedly up, having kept the line down all along the front of the container. I want some drama here. We've kept it fairly flat. We want a dramatic increase in height. And the begonia boweri has beautiful foliage. There's such an infinite variety of foliage patterns in the stove plant. And because you're giving them conditions that are ideal, you're freeing them from the weather, from frost, and all the other things that harm leaves, you're going to get that foliage developing to perfection. It may seem a contradiction to put a saxifraga, a mother of thousands, in the back of the container. What I want to do is to bring the long trailing runners round in to fill this space here, because I've got a little bit of landscape to do there yet. And eventually they'll go up the side. And there you have the planted up garden. Have a look at it. Look at it from all angles before you decide it's finished. That'll do. I want to watch it growing. I don't want it full straight away. Now my little bit of landscape. You can use stones for this. Nudge that up to the earth star, because they do grow beautifully on dry pieces of wood. Then the other piece, just pushed under the leaves of the African violet to lift them up off the ground. Now it needs watering, and don't go sloshing the water in, or you splash it all over the flowers, all over the foliage, and that spoils the whole look of the thing. It's like a tropical thunderstorm. And the way I do it is to get a cane or a flat piece of wood and direct the water down the cane to the particular plant that needs it. That way it's done softly and gently and right to the roots without marking the leaves. And then when the garden's settled down, give it 2 or 3 days, you can put a lid on, and that makes it totally enclosed. You're completely in control of the climate. It's just like having a garden to play in. You can get your fingers in the soil, you can do the watering, you can do the cultivation. You've got the beauty of foliage, the beauty of flowers, totally unsullied by the weather. Everything, as far as a gardener can possibly have it, is under your control. And I know exactly where that's going to go. It's going to go on a little table beside a stone fireplace.